Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation podcast.
Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation, where our experts bring you fresh ideas and new perspectives on how consumers eat, drink, shop, groom, and think. I'm Edward Bergen, global food and drink analyst, all-round foodie, and I am a massive hummus fanatic. I have the delight to introduce you guys to Emma, who's a research analyst in the US, and Kate, who's a global food and drink analyst in the UK. Guys, a little bit more detail about yourselves. Emma.
Yeah, I am on the Mintel Scout team, so I specifically study food and drink startups.
Awesome. And Kate?
Hi guys, so I'm in Mintel as a global food and drink analyst, and I used to work on various brands, and I studied linguistics.
Which might come in handy for today's topic. This is actually a topic that Emma came up with that I think is absolutely fascinating, and then Kate jumped for joy when she heard that we were going to talk about this one. I'm not even going to go into too much detail. We're going to be talking about the language of food, how words and definitions of particular foods, how a product is talked about on pack, how much of an impact this can make on the consumer, on sales, sometimes on legislation, and the legality of the food and drink products that we are allowed to buy. That's as much as I'm going to say. Emma, can you just give us a bit more of a rundown on why the language of food?
Yeah, absolutely. So because I work with food and drink startups in particular, I see a lot of really interesting innovation, particularly in the plant-based and free-from options. But all of that world is dealing with what to call themselves right now, and trying to be regulatorily responsible, but also make sure that the names are something that people would want to eat. So like an example from a long time ago and a different world is that avocados used to be called alligator pears. And they weren't selling at all because they were called alligator pears, which is a silly name. And then the avocado people got together and decided to rebrand and call themselves avocados. And now they sell very, very well.
I feel like this is something we're going to have to Wikipedia and go into, unless you know exactly why they went for the avo. I love it. So just the simplicity of a name change for something to effectively become the product of 2016 that took the world by storm, as being the millennial product, through a simple change like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that like I said, we're seeing it in plant-based and like lab-grown meats. No one wants to buy something called a lab-grown meat. But when it comes down to it, that is one of the alternatives that vegans in particular are looking for. So figuring out what to call it so that it's accurate and it's safe, but also that consumers will actually want to buy it, has been an interesting challenge, and one that startups in particular can't afford to get wrong because they don't have the extra funds.
Their whole business is based on that immediate response just from seeing their pack, without that advertising, without that marketing to help the consumer. It's all about that first message. So it makes absolute sense. Kate, do you have any builds? Do you have anything why you chose to join us for this one?
Yeah, so I just I think language is so fascinating, and in food, it's something we obviously all consume every day. That goes without saying. Language is something we often don't necessarily think about too much, but the impact that language can have on the foods we choose to eat and the foods we choose to incorporate into our routines and our diets, as Emma was just saying, can be really impactful, and I just think that's really fascinating.
It's amazing. I think one thing we wanted to do on this pod when we were having a chat about it beforehand is sometimes it's the simplicity of naming something correctly, but sometimes we're going to get into some of those legal issues. Now, what we thought we'd do, though, the best way to tackle this one is to effectively work through some really great case studies. and think about, when brands have used certain types of language in the past, when it hasn't worked and when it has worked, and why they've needed to do it. And then maybe at the end, we'll maybe think about some of those recommendations on, if you are a budding startup and you're listening to our podcast, and hopefully you are, because that's really exciting, that you'll get a little bit of advice from us, and maybe some recommendations. But have you got some case studies you've seen over the past few years that really make this topic great for you?
Yeah, my favorite one is actually very, very recent. There's a brand called Perfect Day, and they technically did have an ice cream launch, but it was just one day, and then they sold out right away. But what they're doing is they're making flora-based dairy protein, is what they're trying to get people to call it. But it's protein that is made without, like a dairy protein that's made without animals at all. And so trying to convince consumers to eat this and to understand, like wrap their heads around what it is, has been, I can only imagine, a huge challenge for them. Especially since in grocery stores, things like this are still labeled as non-animal whey protein, which isn't nearly as fun. Or
I just wanted to say, I think that's a really interesting example. And, when you say, what did you say, non-animal whey protein,
yeah,
it's really not very enticing for a consumer, is it? I was thinking about this one before, and I think Quorn have actually done a really nice job here. So if you think Quorn, a really long established meat substitute, what they've essentially done is given a brand name to that substitute. And I guess that's kind of what Perfect Day are looking to do, in a sense. They're trying to really rebrand and rename that particular type of protein.
Yeah, absolutely.
What have they made so far? So Perfect Day, you said, was it ice cream, or are there anything else?
Yeah, so their only thing that they have specifically sold is ice cream. Right now, it seems like they're trying to partner up with other food and drink companies that are trying to be vegan or non-animal, and sell the proteins themselves to these companies. And I think one thing that Perfect Day has done a pretty good job of, if you go on their website, they explain the process of making the flora-based dairy protein. So they really walk the consumer through why it's called exactly what it is, and you come out the other end thinking, yeah, that's obvious, the only obvious name for that. Of course, that's what it should be called, which is kind of what you want to get the consumer to. But the education thing is maybe taking longer than it should to be really effective and make them the money that they need to make right away, which is why it's important that they're partnering up with other companies.
So there's no dairy whatsoever in this product.
So it is a dairy protein, but it's a dairy protein made with no cows. So think of it as dairy with just no animals are used.
What is it then? This is why it's so interesting. Like,
exactly. Yeah. So it's because it's brand new, right? So the potential for what we could perceive it as could change on a dime. But they use. Okay. Now I am not from Perfect Day, so I hope that I am saying the right thing here. But it is used. They like get the dairy proteins, and they use like flora, some sort of flower situation.
Okay, I'm going to help
cultivate it.
I'm doing something fun here. No. This is a good. I've just Googled them because that's what we do on the podcast live, and they say 1, dairy flora. First, we took milk's essential genes and added them to microflora, a tiny organism that comes from nature and can produce large amounts of pure protein. So they're using, I guess, the use of science, taking from one species and then mixing it with something else to create something brand new. And I'm not a scientist, so this is great fun for me. And then they said they use fermentation in the process too, and then they can pop it into all the things that we love, which is what they write here: cheese, yogurt, and ice cream is what they're mentioning here. So it is a company. It is that does sound a little bit like how Quorn talk about their creation of their protein. They give us that detail, but interesting that they actually use the term dairy. They use the term milk, and when you look at the products that they've got available, they're saying dairy made perfect as a slogan on pack. Which now, Kate, from a language point of view, does that sound to you like it's misleading when it is Is it dairy?
I think it's a really good question. And as we've just seen, as we've just heard between us, it's a really difficult one to define. And I think really difficult for, consumers to understand what that is, how it's dairy if it doesn't include cow or animal products in. So yeah, from my point of view, I would say that could potentially be misleading. I think there needs to be a lot of education around that kind of information that's going into the consumer domain, because consumers are savvy, right? They want to know what they're eating. I think especially now in the environment that we're living in, people are so much more aware of what they're eating.
Have you got any other?
It's interesting. Oh,
sorry,
just that consumers are savvy and they want to know what they're eating. But I think because language is so nebulous, it's tough for companies to understand. Like, okay, if I say something here, like if between us, even if I say something here, it might not mean the same thing in England. I mean, when I wear jeans and I call them pants, sorry for my friends in England, got scandalous. They can limit themselves to a certain region if they aren't forward thinking in that regard and understand all the different ways something can be interpreted.
Yeah.
So you're talking about that change of region. Have you got any, or either of you, that because something's been launched in the US or it's been launched in Europe, where they've had to change to move it around the world for various reasons?
I think so. I've got a really interesting example, which is to do with Diet Coke. So, in the UK and the US, we call it Diet Coke. It's just a lighter form of Coca-Cola. But it's actually called Coke Light in Germany. And that's down to legislation around the use of the word diet. I actually spoke to some of our German colleagues here in the Mintel office, and they were explaining that, in English, the word diet talks about both the a diet as in going on a diet to lose weight or to manage a specific medical issue, but it's also used as your kind of profile of eating, your everyday diet. In Germany, it's only used for the medicinal kind of side of that word. So for that reason, it's called Coke Light, not Diet Coke, because it's clearly not an actual medicinal product.
It's funny because we can immediately argue with the word light by saying that it's not light because it actually hasn't got any calories in at all. And immediately you can be like, well, it's not a lighter version, it is a zero version. And therefore they made Coke Zero as well. But it's funny how it makes this one, again, it's like a confusing way to look at that brand because of that change in got local culture and sort of legislation around what you're allowed to say.
Yeah, and it is really interesting. I think the great thing with Coke is that it's such a ubiquitous brand worldwide. And the branding itself, the graphics are so striking that you would be hard pressed to be confused by that. I think these kind of products that we've just been talking about, where it's startups with new launches, new kinds of ingredients that consumers aren't so familiar with. I think that's where we're going to see issues. So an example might be there's a product in the States called Country Crock plant butter. Now in the UK, if that were brought over, we wouldn't be able to call that plant butter because it doesn't actually have any butter in. So you'd have to be thinking about what to call that product so as not to confuse consumers.
This is why we had a debate a week or two ago about whether or not peanut butter is allowed to be called peanut butter.
Exactly.
It just got in because it's been around for so long.
They snuck in and they're allowed. I love that. This is why you were asking about this one in the office.
But interestingly, just on that point, I actually read this morning about watermelon seed butter and pumpkin seed butter. So clearly, when you're outside of the kind of chilled dairy category, it's that premise has still continued, that it's okay to call a product butter when it's, I guess, in a paste format.
I wonder if where it lives in the grocery store matters when the industry is thinking about that and like regulators are thinking about that.
Yeah,
next to each other, there's no way to get confused.
Yeah, I think that probably matters.
Talking about this butter, I remember a really good example, and I hope I get this one right. I think it was Flora, and then their Flora Proactive is the margarine brand that we have over in the UK, and I think also in Europe too. And I remember that it used to be many years ago, it was flora, it was margarine, and then they had that. I remember there was the attack on margarine back in 2015. It's full of saturates, it's not as good for you as butter. So what they did, then they reacted to that, the fact that the dairy free came in a big way. They changed the packaging. I think it was from like a greenish yellowish color to a white, and then had dairy free on the front of pack, dairy free spread as their main call out. And then again they changed only a couple of years later. They also reformulated, and then they had it back in green, but they call it plant power, and all to do with just that change of language, but essentially virtually the same product, the same occasion, the same use.
And it's how people view health. That's something I'm noticing with a lot of startups too. The number one way to indicate that you're healthy is a healthy product is to say you're plant-based. Maybe not number one, but it's so popular. Like brands know that if they have that slapped on their label, then consumers who aren't even vegan or trying to be vegetarian will go towards that whenever they're trying to be healthy. Which actually, Lava, another case study that I was thinking about, it did something similar where they changed it's a yogurt, a vegan yogurt company, and they changed their packaging so that it said fewer things on pack. So they used to mention whole food, plant-based, dairy-free, live culture, no sugar added. And now they've trimmed that down to plant-based, dairy-free, no sugar, and they don't talk about the peely nut anymore, which is what it's based off of, because no one knows what the peely nut is.
There's no point mentioning it. Stick it in an ingredients list. It doesn't matter.
No, it's great that they're using it. That's fantastic. But the rebrand to not use it is smart, because consumers don't like to be confused about what something is before they buy it.
It reminds me of, going back to the avocado, a really funny launch a few years ago where, there's all this attack on claims about health. And there was some potato chip brands that basically just wrote avocado oil and in very small writing underneath potato chips. And just using the term avocado oil because it's so trendy as the headline, when actually it is essentially a fried potato product. But they're giving an aura of health by just calling out the ingredient. I'm sure you can do the same with many other vegetables and fruits just by writing it on the pack in a big writing. People get very excited because they think it's they use the word superfood for many years in a big way. It doesn't matter if it was healthy or not. It was the use of the word was a call to arms for the consumer.
Absolutely. It's less about what the product is, and more what that means to the consumer. Which plant-based, what we're seeing with the plant-based burgers that have all just recently launched is the conversation is starting now about how, okay, so if it's plant-based, does that mean these burgers are healthy? Because I don't know that means those burgers are healthy, and consumers are kind of contradictory about it too. I think in one of our plant-based or plant protein reports talks about how the people believe that processed foods are less healthy, but they also want more plant-based things, and they're not sure like which is which. And when a plant-based food is really processed, does that mean it's still healthy? Like, there's no consensus on that right now.
The topic of processed food is a really difficult one for consumers to get their head around, as they want to be eating healthily, but it is difficult to know what's right. I think equally, plant-based burgers, for example, if they are processed and they're not super healthy, that's okay. People go to Burger King for a treat. They go for comfort food. There's a kind of trend about dirty vegan food. There's lots of diners, for example, offering what might be called dirty vegan food, and that's the idea that just because it's plant-based, it doesn't have to be satisfying and comforting. So I think it's okay if it's not 100%.
As long as they communicate it, as long as they say, because that's where the big challenge here. That plant-based often is used as a as a term to say we're healthy, look at me, we're plant-based. And I think that's the big challenge here. The use of that language effectively means healthy to consumers. So it's a tightrope.
Yeah, absolutely. I just read an article recently about the FDA is thinking about redefining what healthy means, or getting a definition for it. It hasn't been looked at in many, many, many years. But I think it's an impossible task. like you can define plant-based and you can define all these more specific things, but you look at healthy and it's so unique to each individual, and people are people don't have the education necessarily that they need. Like, we're lucky in that we're in the food world. So I can look at a plant-based thing and be a little bit more skeptical of it. But I think when you're not surrounded in it, when you're not entrenched in studying food and drink startups, it's not as obvious that these things don't mean healthy. And it's not as obvious what healthy means.
I love the fact that plant-based was even coined, in the last few years, because originally it was the fact that it was the vegan trend. And it was all about vegans, and the media were talking about the vegans, and the vegans are just enjoying the ride, because actually there's not a huge amount more vegans out there. We just ran a piece of research in the UK, and we're getting into like 40% of consumers plus saying that it's about they're already actively reducing their meat consumption, and that's why it's not about this trend isn't about the vegans. It's about the consumers balancing out what they were already their diets and what they're already eating. They're not cutting things out altogether, and that's why it's so interesting. Just the change in from vegan, which could be seen as a stigma word or one small group. Actually, anybody can have plants, right? And I think that's been really interesting change of language that's being used.
And I guess that's that kind of change in consumer behavior. It's why there's so many vegan products that kind of adapt existing meat products using kind of a vegan name, maybe sometimes even a bit of a pun. And we were speaking about this before, I think, Emma, weren't we? And debating whether those kind of puns and gimmicky names are actually suitable for making this a long-term kind of alternative. So I've seen examples like a plant-based chicken nugget line called Incognito, which is great. That's brilliant. I love it. It's really funny. And you've got, veganatoni for vegan panettone. So, these are really great examples of products that are tailoring their ranges to work for flexitarians. But do you guys think that they will actually win in the end with those kind of names?
You've got to make an impact. But I guess you're the startup specialist here, but I just think sometimes you have to make that impact to the consumer, and you have to make them smile for them to pick it up in the first place. I don't know. You can absolutely disagree with me. What do you think?
I don't disagree. I think making the consumer smile should always be a goal. I love that. And I think that is truly the way forward for reaching more people and bringing more people into plant-based diets. I think in the long run, like in the short term, I think it's going to be really effective. In the long run, I think they're going to run into a lot of legislation about whether they're allowed to be called that and whether they're tricking the consumer. There was a podcast I was listening to the other day that talked about, it was a woman who owned a restaurant that was very clearly a vegan restaurant. Like, it was all over their sign that it was a vegan restaurant. And then they got caught up in some legal issues because their menu didn't state that things were vegan with each dish. But it's a vegan restaurant, so should they have to state that things are vegan with each dish?
Because there comes a time where if they say it on the product, everything is, and it's just should be simple. But
yes, but I think it's gonna come down to whether the dairy industry and the meat industry is like, where are they going to bend, and where are they going to finally say, you know what, this isn't a fight worth fighting, and now I'm going to stop and I'm going to start offering alternatives as well, because it's clearly a good business opportunity.
I remember I think it's in France, they've actually banned the use of the word sausage or burger. Is it burger and sausage to be allowed to be used for anything other than meat, because they say it is misleading. And like, when is a sausage a sausage? Is a sausage something that has to have meat in it? Probably originally, but actually for the consumer, is it is a sausage that in that, I don't know how to describe it on a plate, the cylinder of stuffed inside some skin. I don't. What would you even I don't really want to use the term on a podcast because it could be quite rude, and this is a business podcast. But you guys listening out there know what I mean. But that is a sausage to the consumer. It doesn't matter what it's stuffed with. So it's that question of, is there are we getting to a future now where things can be redefined? Can you have a rib made out of seitan, which is a plant-based wheat-based protein? Can we do that and still call it a rib?
I was thinking whilst you were talking out about the burgers and sausages debate, in my mind, that really comes down to more of shape, because we all know that burgers and sausages in particular are maybe made up of lots of different things. So in my mind, that's much more to do with shape. And, there's been veggie burgers around for years. Which were basically a round patty, whether made of beans or vegetables or whatever, that would just be an alternative. So rib is a really interesting example because, yeah, absolutely, it's part of an animal. So I suppose, would you then use it to talk about a vegan or vegetarian product when it has that shape, at least, and then maybe you're talking about your consumption occasion is dictated by the shape of the product?
Yeah, and it's extra interesting when regulators finally step into that conversation, because as far as I know, sausage, and someone can check my etymology on this, I no longer have a subscription to OED, I may be wrong, but I believe that sausage started out just meaning salted. So it didn't necessarily have to be, it just meant salted, and then it slowly morphed because so many people called salted meat sausage, that it slowly morphed into being what it is. I don't know that that evolution of language is quite as easy to see happen anymore, just because things are recorded and regulators step in. But DiGiorno, I think this was 2010, I'm not sure, it was a ways back, had wings spelt with a Z to get around some of the ingredients that they had or did not have. And regulators did step in, and they said, I wrote this down so I wouldn't forget it because it made me laugh. They said it's a fanciful term on poultry product labeling, and they specified that it had to be white chicken and it can't actually contain any wing meat, and no other misspellings on the packages were allowed. And it's just like, there's no consumer who's going to be walking through the store and think, ooh, I better Google what the regulator said about this Z at the end of wings here. Which is just
brilliant.
How did they come upon that? It's
because you've got examples of cheese as well where it's maybe spelt with a Z-E at the end, or instead of double E in the middle, it might be EA. And again, that feels misleading in the same vein.
But for the consumer, remember we're talking about 1% or like a small percent of the population that are actually vegan. For the majority of consumers, that's how they understand the world. And if you can make a product just easier for them to buy than giving it a completely different name, and therefore they may not pick it up because they don't understand it, whose side are we on? It's a really good debate. Because if you see there's a vegan cheese available and it's called cheese, but it's full of great nutrition, but it isn't full of fat, and also it obviously isn't connected to animals in any shape or form. But the consumer knows what to do with it. They see it on shelf. They understand it. Then if it's been given some other name, it helps that sale. So it's a great debate. I think it's going to be one where legislation and governments get involved, and they already are.
Yeah, quite rightly, because you want to help consumers make informed choices. But I think you're absolutely right. For the many people who aren't strict vegans, it doesn't necessarily come down to having wrong information. It's just about knowing what the product is, and ultimately, if that product is nutritious and can be used for the same occasions, great.
So I think we're getting nearish to the end. We ended up going from a start, which is talking about language and a few examples. Building into this, it's actually become quite an interesting look at a very current example, which is plant-based and vegan trend, because I guess that's where we're seeing this appearing the most. But I wonder if each of you can maybe sign off our lovely pod with maybe something you expect to see in the future within this language of food? What should our listeners be looking out for when they go shopping? I don't know, Emma, do you want to give your final thoughts?
I'm so tempted to start with what I hope for rather than what I expect, because what I hope for is that there's going to be some brand that comes up with an innovation that is too good to ignore, and they can name it something really awesome that's going to break the plant-based and free from options out of the constrictions that they're in right now. That is what I'm hoping for. That's what I'm looking for. And I think that will be a game changer. If we can reach that point, the innovation in plant-based will boom in a really good way. That sounds negative, but it's a really, really good way.
Awesome. And Kate, your final sign-off.
Well, I quite liked what Emma said, actually, certainly in terms of hope for. And I think there's so many products that are trying to emulate something else, and therefore, because of legislation, can't put what they're trying to emulate on the packaging, and it ends up being a bit confusing for the consumer. So, if you take vegan butter, for example, in the UK here, as I said, we can't say butter, but ultimately you want to make it as easy as possible for the consumer to understand what they're buying. So if legislation were able to take that into account and ultimately just make it about the consumer's understanding of what is the usage occasion that they can use that product for, I think that would be fantastic.
Awesome. And the thing I'm going to take away from this is, when is a sausage really a sausage? For you guys to sign off and go, you're going to go and pick up the latest shroom dog made out of mushrooms and pea protein, because it still qualifies as some sort of hot dog or a sausage, who knows? But as long as the food tastes good, that's okay with me. So we're going to sign off. And I'm going to say very first, before we do, I just want to say thank you to you guys. You have been awesome, and I hope you'll get onto some more of our Little Conversation podcast in the future. Have you enjoyed yourselves?
So much. I could talk about food language all day.
Good.
It's been great.
So to our listeners, thank you very much for listening. Seriously, please subscribe, please rate and review the pods. We're coming towards the end of our first series of Mintel Little Conversation, so it's really exciting. You can also get this, you can get it on Apple Podcasts, and obviously, please subscribe and rate and review, but also you can get it on many other podcast platforms. So just look it up and you can find us. If you want to know more about Mintel, who we are, what we do, please head over to our website, mintel.com. Find us on all the social media platforms, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. You can probably find these guys on social media as well. Depends if they want to be hounded about food language in their out of hours, but I'm sure they will, because they love it. But otherwise, please catch us next week on Mintel's Little Conversation. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.